Hey folks, I'm Brown Bear. This is the second in a multi-part in-depth design commentary series on Banjo-Kazooie. If you missed the first part, I recommend you watch it so that you understand what's happening in this one. In addition, I once again recommend that you watch this video from beginning to end. However, for the convenience of folks who prefer to jump around, I've provided timestamps to major talking points in the description below. Last time we finished up Treasure Trove Cove, so we're on our way to unlock Clanker's Cavern. We'll notice something interesting if we compare the original Nintendo version with the HD remake. See if you can spot the difference between the two cutscenes. Did you see it? If not, no worries. We'll talk about why it's important later in this video. Clanker's Cavern is Banjo's first and only world with a strong emphasis on swimming. A running joke from this era of platformers was that every game needed to have a water level. It makes sense from a level designer's perspective to center a world around a title's least used top-level mechanic. If they spent the time building swimming into the game, why not fully leverage it? In this respect, it's interesting to look back at the original sketches for the Cavern. The date on this document shows how late it was put together, October of 1997, about halfway through development. It's noteworthy that water plays only a secondary role in these drawings. The emphasis is on Clanker and the platforming sections around him. I'm guessing the longer swimming sections were built in later to pad out the world's length. Like I said earlier, this is a natural conclusion for the level designer to reach. Swimming is always going to be underutilized relative to core platforming. As a result, if content needs to be added, it's one of the first things that'll come to mind. As we swim down to free our trapped buddy, we can see the implications of this approach. Banjo's core game engine, in particular its fixed camera angles, was built and playtested with platforming in mind, since that's the majority of the game's content. Swimming in a fully three-dimensional environment doesn't benefit as much from a fixed camera angle. In fact, it can sometimes be a little confusing. If we jump ahead a little bit to Mad Monster Mansion, we can see how the level designers implicitly acknowledged this. They take advantage of the awkward interaction between the swimming controls and the camera to build a very interesting jiggy. The bottom of the well is certainly achievable with standard swimming controls, but it was designed to be done with the pumpkin because the camera angles make it very difficult to do otherwise. In standard platforming, the direction a character is facing and the direction they're moving are typically identical. Fixing the camera angle has the potential to make things easier by removing a variable the player needs to worry about. As long as they move the analog stick toward the left, the character will always move left on the screen. Swimming removes instantaneous directional changes. This means pressing left while Banjo is facing the player will cause Banjo to turn toward the player's right side. This is confusing on its own. In addition, swimming's three-dimensional nature means there's two additional directions that players need to worry about, up and down. It doesn't help that players haven't gotten as much practice with it as standard platforming. The pressure of the air gauge isn't doing us any favors either. All this means is that a bunch of different features, each contributing to a small increase in difficulty individually, end up in total creating a noticeably more difficult gameplay experience. I've probably made it out to seem worse than it actually is, so I'll emphasize that my point is the noticeable part of noticeably more difficult. Once we get to Bubblegloop Swamp, we'll talk about how different that is from the rest of Banjo's difficulty design. Water levels acquired a pretty bad reputation back in the 90s, and I'd imagine a lot of the folks watching this video can identify with that slight sinking feeling anytime you realize you've entered a game's quote-unquote water level. Now that Clanker's been freed, we'll finish up the rest of the swimming areas. Last time we discussed how the game's core loop emphasizes puzzle solving and exploration. Collectible items are a result of these activities rather than the player's primary focus. A consequence of this approach is that the level design flows outward, meaning levels are only as large as the sum total of the interesting sections a level designer can put in them. This is the opposite of the inward flowing approach found in a lot of modern level design, where the world is built first and the content is added later. I'd argue that the difference between the two approaches is not necessarily an evolution in game design, rather it's just the removal of technical limitations. Modern developers have the luxury of building extremely large worlds at little to no cost. Back in the 90s, this just wasn't the case. If Rare wanted to include something in Banjo-Kazooie, they really needed to think it through. The result is that a limitation, the inability to create infinitely large worlds, ends up acting as an asset because it forced the developers to make good decisions about what they included in their game. Clanker's Cavern acts as a bit of an exception to this, largely because of the emphasis on swimming. In comparison to standard platforming, swimming is a lot slower. It also needs to cover a lot more space, otherwise it'll end up feeling too cramped. In order to hit the right pacing, the world needs to first occupy a certain amount of space. Collectible items are then added later to fill it out. I think this is one of the reasons a few of the underwater sections in the cavern, particularly the Jiggy at the end of the underwater hallway, come across as a little uninspired, at least to me personally. I feel like the level designers knew they had to put something there, but weren't sure what, and so they just added something rather than really thinking it through. I think a lot of the secondary collectibles like Jinjos and Mumbo tokens help fill in the gaps here. If the designers limited themselves purely to Jiggies and musical notes, they would have faced a much tougher problem in building dense, interesting worlds to explore. Musical notes feel like they should be collected in groups. It would feel strange to complete a whole section and only get one note out of it. The singular note marking the path to the lighthouse was very noticeable back in the cove. The secondary collectibles solved this problem by feeling more meaningful as individual items, which gave the designers additional freedom in properly building out worlds. They help resolve the design conflict between density and exploration. There's a bunch more to do inside a Clanker, but I honestly don't have much to say about it. The aesthetic here is a bit of a turnoff for me as a player, so I usually just get through it as quickly as possible so I can get to the next level. One notable pickup while we're here is the Wonderwing, the Cavern's only new move. A pattern we'll continue to see is the intelligence with which the level designers place new moves within a world, ensuring that a player won't have to backtrack too much if they learn the move really late in their exploration. The problem with backtracking is not so much seeing the same place twice, as it is forgetting that a place exists to begin with. You don't want a player to feel like they need to traverse an entire level just to find the one thing they need to do. The Wonderwing has exactly one use in this level, and it's right next to where the player learns it. Another interesting detail about this particular interaction is that it's one of the 3 Jiggies explicitly marketed on the back of the box. I'm really curious about which came first. Did they create this situation explicitly because it's easily marketable, or did they first design all the Jiggies and then conclude this was among the most appealing to consumers? I'm honestly not sure, and it's an interesting thing to think about, especially given the changing relationship between marketing and design over the past 20 years of games development. Alrighty, it's been fun seeing our buddy Clanker again, so with a heavy heart we'll exit the cavern and get to the next world. We're now on our way to Bubblegloop Swamp. I absolutely love this level's name. It feels warm and happy, almost like a bath. As soon as we get in, we're going to turn around and learn about the Stilt Stride move, which I had always thought of as the rubber boots until I decided to make this commentary. The first thing we'll use the boots for is to grab this Jinjo, which underscores a point I made earlier. The level designer had the flexibility to include this bridge and pond area because the secondary collectibles help fill it out and make it feel interesting to explore. Unfortunately, the boots don't last forever, so we've got to be pretty quick. That's a good thing to practice now, since our next Jiggy is going to require some fast movement. Bubblegloop Swamp is the first world in Banjo to rely heavily on timers. Both the boots and multiple Jiggies force the player to achieve their objective within a set time limit. This is interesting because of its contrast with the gameplay we've experienced up to this point. Our adventure so far has been fairly relaxed. We could go at our own pace and explore worlds at our leisure. We've faced some time pressure before, particularly with the air gauge in Clanker's Cavern, but not quite like this. Speaking personally, one of the best parts of the 3D platformers of this era was the ability to set your own pace, explore the world, really soak it in and enjoy yourself. The fact that there is no hurry makes the open-ended puzzle design a lot more enjoyable, because you can experiment and observe the world around you without feeling rushed. Timers are a source of tension in this otherwise serene environment. They stick out in the gameplay experience, at least to me. Now that we've picked up our first Jiggy, we can start exploring the rest of this world. Our old friend Tanktop needs some help, and we're more than happy to oblige. We need to be careful though, because this is the first time we've encountered a constant damage-dealing environmental hazard, the swamp itself. It doesn't seem like a big step up from the air gauge in Clankers, but we've come a long way since Mumbo's Mountain. Bubblegloop Swamp features tougher enemies, a section where you can fall to your death instantly, and the piranha's environmental hazard. Slowly but surely, the game has gotten substantially harder, and it's not just the environment. Jiggies on timers, memory challenges, and Mr. Vile are quite a ways from stepping on some orange blocks. What's amazing about all this is that it happens without the player even realizing it. The gently sloping difficulty curve slowly teaches the player the skills they need without ever forcing them to deliberately practice. I'd argue that this approach comes squarely from the influence of Nintendo. It's something that they consistently apply to all of their games in a very intentional way. Kensuke Tanabe, a producer at Nintendo, explains this approach as it's typically applied. Perhaps one of the core principles of building gameplay at Nintendo might be the idea of starting with a really simple intuitive core concept, one that, say, a child could learn for themselves and quickly learn to enjoy, and then build layers of additional complexity around that could be enjoyed and explored by people who have the skill to exploit them. Start simple and layer on difficulty as the player moves forward. It sounds easy, but it's extraordinarily difficult to get right. After the acquisition of Rare by Microsoft, retrospectives on the company noted how much employees missed creative collaboration with Nintendo. I'd argue difficulty is a great example. When it's done well, it's nothing short of beautiful. It produces an experience that's engaging and fun. I'd go as far as to say that the second half of Banjo just wouldn't be the same without this philosophy. Many of the later Jiggies rely on key lessons that are learned in these initial worlds, and the developers wouldn't have felt comfortable including them had they not built up to them properly. Bubblegloop Swamp contains plenty of examples of this. It builds upon the lessons of Treasure Trove Cove's raised pillars, offering a slightly more difficult section for players to traverse. Meanwhile, it introduces the concept of backtracking with Mr. Vile, but doesn't require it until the next world. While difficulty is an interesting concept to think about, let's get back to exploring and solving puzzles. The swamp's Grunty Switch is found in this hut section. While we're here, let's go ahead and press it. The Grunty Switch system is ingenious because it ties together Banjo's hub world with each of its individual levels. This creates a feeling of togetherness and connectivity and contributes to the player's sense of immersion. In the original game, collected musical notes didn't persist across world entries and exits. This meant a player was incentivized to complete a world in its entirety prior to exiting. This had the potential to create a jarring transition between regular gameplay and Grunty's Lair gameplay. The Grunty Jiggy system smooths this out. While we're grabbing this Jiggy, we're also inadvertently discovering the path to the next two levels, which gives us some more concrete direction. Speaking of the next two levels, we still need to actually unlock them. There's a ton going on in this small little segment, and I think it's all worthy of discussion. Let's start with the cutscene comparison I mentioned earlier. Did you spot the difference? In the original version, the Mumbo token was invisible due to the title's draw distance. This matters because of the impact it has on player engagement. Banjo-Kazooie continuously rewarded exploration. It cultivated a feeling within players that every nook and cranny, no matter how small, contains something worth finding. Even something as random as jumping on the pipe connecting to a new level would result in some meaningful reward. This created an assumption in players' minds that the whole world, in its complete and total entirety, was worth exploring. The remake faithfully recreated this feeling with its fixed camera angles, but not with its draw distance. This occasionally has the effect of making the player think that if they can't see something interesting must not exist. After all, they should be able to see it from any distance. Unlocking Freezeezy Peak depends heavily on the player proactively exploring to find the hidden tunnel behind the swamp. The engagement with the game that was cultivated by all the previous little secrets pays off in this moment. Hopefully, the player has been convinced that everything is worth taking a look at. My point is that the original did this a bit better, once again thanks to a technical limitation. Now that we've arrived in our secret area, we observe a musical transition as well. Take a listen. "1998 was almost 20 years ago, but to this day I still remember the feeling that I'd discovered something truly special here. Tucked away in this grimy swamp was a magical, snowy wonderland, and nothing gave me more pause than the beautiful transition in music. The sudden quietness, the almost Christmas-like ring of the tunes, it stuck with me to this day. I'm sure many games have done this before, but for me personally, the musical transitions from area to area are one of the iconic, defining features of Banjo-Kazooie. I've identified two elements that are really key to this. One is simple consistency. The music is thematically aligned with the environment's aesthetic, in this case a snow world. But there's a lot more to it than that. Banjo-Kazooie features a dynamic soundtrack that adapts itself to the player's location. The game identifies key areas where the music can smoothly transition from one track to another. As the player changes location, the game changes tracks based on their surroundings. Take a look at how this was done outside the entrance of Freeze-Easy Peak. This is amazing cooperation between composer and developer. The composer intentionally builds tracks that mesh well together, including key points where they can smoothly transition from one to another. The developers then build in logic to transition between pieces depending on the player's location. This is a key component to the game's immersion. You can transition from environment to environment without ever breaking your suspension of disbelief. In a game that relies so heavily on themed levels, this is a big deal, and they really nailed it here. The music's gotten us all very excited, so it's time to unlock Freeze-Easy Peak. I mentioned last time that the Jigsaw pieces feel meaningful to collect because they play a genuine role in the game. The player uses them to fill in paintings and unlock new worlds. That might not sound very compelling on its own, but it's important to pay attention to what the paintings actually do. They open up the player's imagination and make the world seem a lot bigger than they actually are. Consider Freeze-Easy Peak. We start with the faint outlines of a snow world, but we're not sure what to expect. Notice what happens as we put each Jiggy into the painting. Mumbo's house appears, and we get excited about a new transformation. The snowman's face is revealed, and we wonder whether we can climb all the way to the top. We see a wide open sky, and imagine what it'd be like to fly around freely. A mountain range is in the distance, giving the world a sense of size and depth. We see a glimmering lake and wonder what's in there. We see a winding path leading up to the snowman, and now we're sure we'll be able to go up there. The last two pieces fill out the rest of the world, and we're ready to go. By the time we finished putting in Jiggies, we can't wait to get into this new world. Before we've even entered Freeze-Easy Peak, our imagination is filled with the possibilities of what we might encounter. We get carried away a little bit. The world starts to seem a lot bigger than it actually is. This small setup, where the player first unlocks the world and imagines to themselves what's inside prior to entering, has a really big payoff. It once again builds engagement with the game and prompts players to look ahead and get excited. Freeze-Easy Peak is the first level I really fell in love with back in the original game, and it's not just the nuts and bolts of walking around in the snow. It was the sense of wonder I felt as I placed my Jiggies into the painting, one by one. Now that the peak is open, we've got one last thing to do. Meeting up with our old friend Cheato. That'll require us to turn back into a crocodile. It's worth mentioning that the reason we feel confident doing this is because the game set a precedent for it, way back in Mumbo's Mountain. The Grunty Jiggy was intentionally placed out in the open to encourage players to try to get to it, only to realize they need the termite transformation. This quietly taught them that they can leave worlds while transformed. Cheato provides cheat codes that make the game easier for us. This first one is for carrying extra eggs. Despite the nomenclature, I'd argue that the developers fully expected a majority of players to find these cheats. Banjo-Kazooie has this amazing ability to make secrets feel like you're the only player discovering them. Freeze-Easy Peak feels like it's tucked away, a hidden world that few will find, yet it's notable that it's impossible to beat the game without at least opening all 9 worlds. This means that the developers expected you to find this painting, which means they expected you to see the entrance to Cheato. And the termite lesson from Mumbo's Mountain means they expected you to know about leaving worlds while transformed. All this is to say that the Cheato secrets are not so much secrets as they are things that the developers fully expected you to find, but hidden well enough to make it seem like you're discovering something only you have found. It's honestly brilliant, and I love the way this was done. To this day, every time I find the painting of Freeze-Easy Peak, I feel like I've discovered this huge secret, even though I've probably beaten the game more than a dozen times. We're almost at the 20-minute mark, so I think this is a good time to stop. Next time, we'll be heading into Freeze-Easy Peak. Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this video, please consider following me here or on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.